And we are live. Hi everyone, my name is Steve Torso. I'm the founder and managing director of Wholesale Investor, and I'd just like to say welcome to our special live stream that we're doing tonight. There's two things we're going to be talking about. Obviously, the first one's going to be an introductory conversation with Friska, who, for me, I met just over a month ago, and was probably one of the most sort of fascinating conversations around the area of change management. And then secondly to that, I'm going to be giving a bit of a breakdown as far as on WI Capital and some of the initiatives that we're working on as part of that. Now, obviously, I want to say welcome to both the investors and the founders that are watching this. And to give you some sort of context, I think this session is just so appropriate in so many ways for the fact that, 5 weeks ago, we were actually setting up to host our first live in-person event since February 2020. And we're going to be hosting it like literally last week was when we're going to be doing it. And then everything started to change where we had to spend a week at home. And, obviously the lockdown part kept on proceeding. And we were sort of in that stage where we were quite unsure about what comes next. And when I watched Friska talk, and it was just before the lockdowns, I just thought there couldn't be anything more appropriate than for us as founders and for you guys, the investors. And for the investors, my hope is that there's takeaway points that you can overlay to some of your investee companies, in that we're basically always dealing with change. Like in the environment we're dealing with, and especially at the moment, none of us really know how this is going to play out over the next couple of months. And a lot of the decisions aren't actually in our hands. But at the end of the day, we've all got teams that rely on us as leaders, or teams that basically work with us as investors. And our job as part of that is to obviously lead and to guide and to manage through that change. And so in having Friska on today, and I'm going to be going to the sort of double stream in a second, this is just such an important topic that covers so many of the areas that we're working with, and how we can effectively communicate that to whether it be the founders that you're working with, and as I said, as the teams that you're working with. So on that note, I'm going to introduce Friska. So just give me 1 second and I'll send live. Welcome, Friska. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Steve. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Now, really appreciate you joining me for this live stream. And as I said in the sort of introduction, this is just such an important time to be talking about this as a topic. Now, I know from your perspective, you talk about change management in relation to how companies can overlay sort of innovation into their organizations. But really, the principles you talk about cover all types of change. It covers the adverse environments that we're in now. It covers the adoption of innovation inside companies, and it relates to all of us on so many levels. So as a starting point, please give us a bit of an introduction to you and your background.
Sure. So I help organizations and the individuals within them more readily accept and thrive through change. And as you said, change comes in all shapes and sizes. It could be a merger and acquisition. It could be an offshoring program. It could be a restructure. It could be an operating model redesign. It could be an organization-wide technology program that's being implemented. So I help buck the 80% failure rate that is present whether you read an HBR review or a McKinsey review. And guess what? 9 times out of 10, it's not the change that's the challenge. It's actually the people. They haven't been brought on. So that's my role, to smooth that transition to a new way of behaving in organizations.
And for you, when you're working with companies, there's always a starting point. So if you were to give, whether it be investors looking at this that are sort of, dealing with founders that are going through their own sort of ranges of change, or you're dealing with the founders directly, what is that starting point for you when you're actually working with an organization?
The starting point for me would be to analyze a 4D analysis. So what is the current state of the organization? What is its culture like? What are the leaders like? How is information disseminated and communicated there? What's been their past performance with change? Has it been really bad? If it's been really bad, then people have a knee-jerk reaction to anything new and unconventional. And then I help get them to crystallize and really define what is it that the change that they want to make. And you'll find a change in one area often has unintended consequences in other areas. So I'll give you an example to articulate this. I was at a very large engineering company, and there was a massive cost-cutting program where any client-facing work had to be sent offshore to a lower-cost country. So that meant, engineers and drafters in Australia, America, Canada, the UK, some of them were losing their jobs. But what the company didn't realize is that that change depended on someone doing things differently. And that someone, in this case, was the project manager. So the project managers didn't get involved or buy into it because their KPIs did not align to this change. So they weren't aligned to being the cheapest project. They were aligned with exceeding customer expectations, being on time, meeting their SLAs, certain quality standards. So, the change was a change in process, send work to a cheaper country. But then the unintended changes as fallout from that is job descriptions, reward and recognition systems. So this is what you have to keep in mind when you first enter an organization. They may want a change, in this corner, but you'll find it then has a domino effect to other areas.
And how can how can you, I suppose, assess what, if you are looking to overlay those changes, what do you say is the first step that, basically organizations should be looking at doing? How do they enroll the different teams involved? How do they, I suppose, communicate that vision? How do they create that capability, et cetera, inside their different teams?
You've touched on it in your question, which is all about communication. Like you said, everything's changing nowadays. And we've heard of that really simple acronym KISS, keep it simple, stupid. So when you're trying to get people on board with a vision, that's what you want to do. But because we are so busy and time poor and distracted, and there's things coming on for all angles, it's actually now MIFKISS, which is make it frequent, keep it simple. So chunk everything into bite-sized chunks, and don't be disheartened if people don't get it the first, second, third, fourth time. Just keep going until you start to hear your vision parroted back at you. It may not be your exact same words, but that's when it's sunk in and you've got people's attention. And when it comes to getting people on board with a vision, nothing creates ownership like involvement. Right. An example is the most successful continuous improvement program in GE. It was so successful because how the change was to happen, it wasn't mandated. All the CEO did was say, these are our goals. This is what we're trying to do. Help us get there. And that way people get skin in the game and they're more passionate to see it through.
And typically when going through any type of change, you find that there's different team members that have different personalities. You find that typically you've got some team members that are very adaptable and very agile towards change and embrace it as something new, something fresh, something exciting, etc., or they see it as of it. And then you have other team members that may be a bit slower in that process, or they're used to doing things in the old version of what the company was sort of focused on. What would be your guidance to work with some of those team members that struggle with that? And also the second part to the question is how do you stop what could be some of the negative influences from those sort of existing sort of habits impacting the sort of newer habits that you're forming?
Yeah, so people fear change and they resist because they fear loss. They fear loss of power, position, protection, or prestige, right? So you have to put yourself in their shoes and understand which of those 4 Ps is driving this behavior. And once you understand that, you can either use education, involvement, or communication to remedy that. As for the people that are really gung-ho and passionate about the changes, it's more powerful coming from the trenches, someone's standing up and saying why they believe in that change. So buddy up the resistant with the people that are really passionate about it and see what happens. And in terms of people clinging to the old way of doing things, often it's because they don't see how the new way of doing things is better. So help them understand, provide analogies, use cases, examples, peer comparisons of people that have done this change that you're wanting their support with versus those that haven't, and you really, really showcase the benefits. Yeah, every single win should be celebrated and make it easy to visualize progress.
And when you're talking about that reinforcement, what sort of cadence are we looking at? Are we looking at on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis? What do you see as being the most effective cadence for that?
It really depends on the stakeholder, but for the people on the ground it's their actual job that's being impacted, I do it weekly. So for example, I'm supporting four different companies in different sectors. And every week I report the adoption stats, I showcase the high performers, and it really helps incite some competitive spirit. And if it's a new system, I'll even include a tip of the day or feature someone that's shared an incredible way to use this new system and how it's made their life better. So it's more powerful when it comes from different spokespeople, but at the end of the day, the key messages are consistent, that the new way of doing things is better. So that's what I mean by reinforcement, and making sure people are rewarded and remunerated, and it's aligned with the change. And you know, like with any transformation, it needs to start and it needs to be backed at the top. So the leaders really have to be consistent in vocalizing their support for this.
And typically with all change, there's obviously, there's two parts of change, right? There's the exciting upside and there's the wrestle and the challenge that typically comes with it. And you mentioned something really nice in there about the sort of reward for implementation and making sure that there's sort of incentives aligned with that. What are some of the most effective incentives that you see when sort of that behavior is rewarded, or those values being sort of adopted are rewarded?
Believe it or not, it's not the hefty bonus. It's not cash. Nothing incites motivation like wildfire, like recognition. When I was leading the change management efforts for the largest gold miner on the ASX, I had a really big coup because I got one of the very well-respected leaders in the organization, who's literally worshipped like a god. He has a public holiday named after him. He was very open to being fed information as to who was a supporter, who really put in the hard yards to, to make sure something was perfect pre-go live. And he did that. He did that acknowledgement face to face. And the 20 seconds that it took him to say those two sentences was far more effective at drumming up even more support for this change than any bonus could have. So we really need to get back to basics. It's not about the flashy bells and whistles. It's about being recognized and rewarded by someone you hold in high regard, and that someone is your leaders.
And what I loved about when you sort of gave your talk to us is that you talked about the culture around, and you did this at the start of today, you talked about the culture around innovation, because obviously people can make changes, but unless it's done right, obviously it's very easy to go back to either old behaviors, old processes, etc., if not monitored. And so in your structuring, what would you say would be the key steps or key to make sure that it is just a perpetual process, that the company is focused on innovation, it is focused on that, I suppose, not just, it goes from being change management to just consistent evolution of the business and its drive forward?
It needs to have regular executive visibility. So get it into something that the company is already familiar with. And in that situation where I gave my talk, it was the process by which they measured value. It was a continuous improvement process. And really be clear on what the cultural symbols are for that particular step. We're talking about innovation. Well, innovation has a high failure rate. So that means you should be acknowledging people and giving people kudos for making the attempt at innovation, not when something works, right? It's not always going to be a pat on the back, but really focusing it on learning. So once you have things like that in place, it will be easier and easier to accept that as business as usual. So it needs to be talked about, it needs to be visible, it needs to have leadership backing. Otherwise, it will just be relegated to the corporate graveyard like so many other change initiatives.
Now, I suppose my last question is, we've talked about all the things that founders and investors can work on their companies with. The next one will be what have you seen some of the errors that companies really making going through these what are some of the obviously there's always big errors to make as far as not having support from the top down, not sort of you mentioned as far as the reinforcement of it, building the internal capacity and so forth. What are some of the simple errors because I just find in everything, sometimes the simple things where you make the biggest mistakes can have some of the greatest impact. What are some of those things that we should be aware of?
100%. A common pushback that I get is that it's going to take too long, that engaging people is going to take too long, putting more effort into how we communicate is going to take too long. And my response to that is you can either spend a reasonable amount of time getting people on the bus, or you can spend an unreasonable amount of time, battling resistance all the way to the very end. And at times it will kill it. And the second most common mistake that I see is severely under-resourcing the time and the effort needed to get people accustomed to doing things differently, right? If your business case benefits, if 80% of them depending on people changing their behavior, it doesn't make sense for you to be so tight-ass with your change management budget. So time and time again, I've seen short-term thinking lead to long-term fixing.
And typically whenever there's any type of change for anything, there's always going to be obstacles that sort of come up. Typically, how do you encourage, I suppose, leaders or how people sort of involved directly? How do you typically give them guidance on approaching those different obstacles?
So depending on the obstacle to performance, it could be an informational gap. It could be they're just quite scared. Like so many times I've done projects where, there's so much emphasis being placed on this piece of technology as like the saving grace of the organization. And then they turn it on, expect people to use it straight away. It doesn't work like that, right? You need to build in practice opportunities before you get to that stage, because who wants to look stupid? Who wants to fail? Nobody does, right? And in a very technical organizations such as engineering, mining, like the stakes really are high and people have a lot of face to lose. So don't expect people to adopt immediately. It has to be a gradual crescendo. Like think of when all of us first learned to ride a bike. We knew the theory. You get on the bike, you put your feet in the pedals, then you go, go, go. But we all had our training wheels on first. We did that for a few times before we built up the capability to do something new. The same goes for organizations. So don't push people off a cliff. Make sure there's a gradual ramp up towards that. And I might add one more thing also, actually. So if an organization has historically not managed change well or not given any attention to it, don't underestimate the impact of that legacy on your people, because they probably associate it with a very negative experience. And this plays out in our lives every single day. So I'll give you an example. BC, before COVID, I was walking around town with my best friend. We were deciding where to go for lunch, right? This is in Sydney. And I saw Jimmy's Falafels, and it was written up at broadsheet, very famous chef started it up. And I said to my bestie, oh, let's go there. It looks really good. I saw it in broadsheet. She's like, no. I was like, what do you mean no? She's, I had a falafel once 8 years ago. It was terrible. I'm not doing it again. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like one bad experience turned her into a lean, mean falafel avoiding machine. So this happens in organizations all the time, right? One bad deployment, one bad time, like a merger and acquisition went wrong. You automatically think, oh my God, it's all like that. I'm going to be in for a world of pain. So the more change has been left up to chance to get right, the more effort you should spend in getting it right, the more efforts that's needed to bring people on board.
If there was a way for you to describe the different phases of change management, if we were to break it down into like three categories, like this, you've got obviously the start and then how is there a way for you to categorize what that should feel like or what that should look like for a founder or for an investor?
So for me as a change expert, so the first is pre-planning. Before you even start thinking of it, you need to assess the organization. Second is managing and executing. And the third is embedding and sustaining. And change is not a linear process, because at the end of the day, you're dealing with humans, and humans are irrational as much as we like to not admit
it. And they're
it.
even more irrational at the moment, that is for sure.
Yeah. And don't, all I can say is when you're dealing with people like that, you can't give up. Like resistance is not going to come overnight. You are not going to change someone's opinion of something in three meetings. It's all through with consistency and making sure your entire leadership cohort are on board and credible as well. So when someone asks them something about the change in a public arena, they know the answer straight off the bat, bang, bang, bang. Because any arming and eyeing, any wishy-washy response is going to undermine any credibility about the change effort. So a lot of pre-planning goes into it before you even start to communicate to your people.
Well, Friska, thank you so much for tonight. Really appreciate the opportunity to do this live stream with you and to have this discussion. Any final words you'd like to share on this as an area?
change really has the power to either cripple or propel a company forward. So it doesn't make sense to, leave it up to nature to do. You can seize control of this because change is only going to happen faster. It's going to get more complex and far-reaching than ever. I mean, look at the impact of COVID, for example. It can happen in the blink of a heartbeat.
So true. Well, again, thank you very much, Friska. Now, look, I'll send out as part of this, I'll put your information into the actual description session. I said, your session that you hosted with us as part of Tech was absolutely phenomenal. It was one of my favorite sessions over the last couple of years. So thank you very much for your time and really appreciate it.
You're welcome. See ya.
See ya.